We continue our way through Deuteronomy chapter 3 this morning in the passage that we've just had read to us from verses 12 through 22. Following the conquests of the kingdoms of Sihon as well as that of Og, we find now here we have come into a movement through this progression of the chapter as we find it. And we have here the description that Moses gives, recounting how the land was indeed divided on the eastern side before the crossing of the Jordan into the land of Canaan itself specifically. And then some fascinating and wonderful elements that come particularly in the second half of this morning's passage, which will draw out for us not only a number of lessons contextually, but also some very pertinent and poignant applications for even ourselves in our own time. And so we'll move our way through. There will be elements to explain, of course, because we're in another passage where we have a whole host of Hebrew names that to most of us are completely and entirely unfamiliar. And so again, once more I shall do my best to bridge that gap. But what we have for us this morning is an important passage. And so let us begin here in verse 12 of the third chapter of Deuteronomy. So we took possession of this land at the time, from Aroer, which is in the valley of Arnon, and half the hill country of Gilead, and its cities I gave to the Reubenites and to the Gadites. The rest of Gilead and all of Bashan, the kingdom of Og, I gave to the half-tribe of Manasseh, all the region of Argob. Concerning all Bashan, it is called the land of the Rephaim. What we're getting here is a description which, if you had have been reading through these passages going back into the book of Numbers, where this is all actually taking place in real time, you will find that what Moses is doing here is recounting and summarizing the important elements of what we had read for us, certainly in part earlier in the liturgy, back in Numbers chapter 32, which is the crossover that this particular passage is referencing back to. You have the description in fulfillment of promises going back through the Torah, through the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, describing how God had indeed promised these various portions of land, these allotments of land, both east and west of the Jordan, to the 12 tribes who would then fulfill this promise given so long ago, even from their day, to their patriarch Abraham. That indeed they would come into this land that is bountiful, that is referred to using a very common figure of speech in the ancient Near Eastern world, land of milk and honey, okay? Things that were luxurious and sweet, things that were good and nourishing. And this is how this land is indeed described, including this land east, in this case, of the Jordan River. Whilst the majority of land that eventually, as you keep reading through the scriptures, through particularly the books of Joshua and Judges, which come in succession, you find then obviously the majority of the land that the Israelites possess is of course in the land of Canaan as we know it, the land west of the Jordan. But here these two former Amorite kingdoms, that of Sihon and that of Og, are possessed also by the Israelites, particularly and primarily by the tribes here in specific reference that we've had just thus far of Manasseh, as well as the subdivisions that we see continuing forward. If you keep reading through verse 14, Moses here continues, Yair the son of Manasseh took all the region of Argob as far as the border of the Geshurites and of the Maacathites, and called it, that is Bashan, after his own name, Havaot Yair, as it is to this day. Again, another scribal explanation of these various lands. What you have here, and this can sometimes seem overwhelming when we get these listings of names which are unfamiliar to us, of land that we're not quite entirely familiar with, if at all. What we're having here described to us, even as you continue through, is the land that we've seen in the previous weeks. Okay, the lands east of the Jordan. Indeed, in verse 15 it continues, and to Machir I gave Gilead, and to the Reubenites and to the Gadites I gave from Gilead, even as far as the valley of Arnon, the middle of the valley as a border, and as far as the river Yavok, the border of the sons of Ammon, that is the Ammonites, which we've seen in previous weeks. Verse 17, the Arava also, with the Jordan as a border, so the Jordan River as a western border, from Kinnereth, even as far as the Sea of Arava, the Salt Sea. Okay, so Kinnereth being another name for the Sea of Galilee, and here indeed to the south, the Sea of Arava, that is the sea salt or the salt sea, you find indeed is what we call today the Dead Sea, by virtue of its extremely high salt count that results in nothing being able to live there. Okay, so names which you are hopefully then familiar with. What this is more or less describing to us is all the way down south from the Dead Sea up to the north to the Sea of Galilee, okay, up north where Bashan is, even up all the way to the various lands beyond Galilee on the eastern side. These are the lands which we have seen the Israelites been moving through for a number of weeks now, that they now come into full possession of. And so this is a specific explanation on the part of Moses as to these lands recounting to us. Right? If you were talking to a medieval peasant in England 1,000 years ago, they would have had no clue where these places were. That's fine. Fortunately, these days, with a simple Google search on the internet, it's very easy to find out where, approximately speaking, these various territories were. And you can actually see for yourself where they are. That's the great blessing that we have today. But nonetheless, the point here is not as specifically about what the land is, although that's obviously important. What here Moses is doing is showing, as we've been working our way through, keeping in mind this is a speech on the part of Moses, as he's recounted for you all the major details of these conquests of the Amorites, of Sihon and of Og, of these lands and of these peoples once held so fearsome and mighty, now brought to ruin, now brought down to nothing, before indeed a people who were lesser than them in terms of number and capability and resources and all such things. Here now they come into possession of the land as an act of redemption. That's the overarching point of what's being explained here. When we see this, we have to, especially for us as part of the New Covenant who have the whole picture before us in the Scriptures, Old and New Testament, we have to see the big picture whenever we're actually moving through the story. Does that make sense? We have to be able to zoom out, as it were, and see what is the overarching point. And this is one of the blessings that, quite frankly, every single one of us have to be part of the New Covenant, is that we see the big picture by the grace of God. We have before us the whole story. As you are reading of these people, as you are reading of times, in this case nearly 3,500 years ago, they are people who are in the middle of the proverbial story. They are in the middle of it. They are looking forward to something. They have a hope that they're indeed looking forward to. And make no mistake, we of course do also. We ourselves are part of this great redemptive history. But indeed, the way in which this redemptive history, as we refer to it, works is as it hinges and indeed revolves around the axis that is the incarnation of Christ himself, of the second person of the Trinity, of the Blessed Son, taking upon himself in adoption humanity, becoming truly man, whilst also remaining truly God, and then fulfilling all the various messianic types and images and roles, fulfilling everything that had been so foretold about this great anointed one, this king, this Messiah, who would indeed be the one upon whom this redemptive history would rest, past, present, and future. And when we see this, we are not to get caught up or confused in place names. Important because, again, keeping in mind, and this is a point which will be made by the time we work our way through towards the end of this morning's passage, this is Moses explaining and demonstrating that God is, even in his day, indeed fulfilling that which he had promised long ago to Abraham. And this was the beginning of this fulfillment in a true and tangible kind of way. We too then look upon this and must see the broader point that indeed God fulfills his promises. This is why by the time we arrive at verse 18, this is precisely what Moses points to. If you see there in verse 18, we read the following. And I commanded you at that time, saying, Yahweh your God has given you this land to possess it. This is the common phraseology which we've already had a number of times, so many times throughout just these opening chapters of the book of Deuteronomy. It is the kind of phraseology we find replete throughout the book of Numbers, throughout the book of Leviticus, throughout going back especially into the book of Exodus, as well as, of course, speaking in regards to the future from that perspective, the words uttered even in the days of Abraham, that they would possess this land. The land which Abraham had himself been shown, which he had been brought to in this great odyssey, as it were, across the Mesopotamian world, moving with he and his kin as patriarch from the land of Ur of the Chaldees, that is in southern Babylonia, the lands of Sumeria and Arcadia, across the Fertile Crescent to this blessed land. All these things have been building and building and building for hundreds of years, especially in some of the most unexpected ways. If you were writing a story, most people would not have the very people who were meant to inherit the promise end up spending hundreds of years enslaved in Egypt. But indeed, we find that this is the great and incredible plan of Almighty God. That indeed Yahweh your God has given you this land to possess it. Nehemiah recounts this in chapter 9 of his book. We read in verses 22 and 23 this summary in such beautiful words. He says in verse 22 and 23, "You also gave them kingdoms and peoples and apportioned them to them as boundaries. They took possession of the land of Sihon, the king of Heshbon, and the land of Og, the king of Bashan. You made their sons numerous as the stars of the heavens, and you brought them into the land which you had said for their fathers to enter and to possess." Nehemiah again looking back upon this, just as we too look back upon this, and see one of the most important elements of what Moses here is recounting in his day, that we too see and learn from, which is that God is faithful. When God says, so it is. When God promises, he is true and just to fulfill all that he has said. There is not a word that is uttered by the Almighty that goes left or unanswered, that goes wanton, that goes astray, that is just left lingering with no sense of certainty as to what that means or to what that has done in this world. And it is the one who spoke forth creation itself, the one who said, and so it was, the one who said, let there be light, and such as was. This is who God is. What he says, he does. What he says, he fulfills. What he says, he accomplishes. We have this kind of motif in some of the most famous areas of Scripture, especially those pertaining to the Messiah, to Christ himself. You might recall Isaiah chapter 9, this incredible prophetic passage which we often roll out at Christmas time, but is of course fundamental to our theology of who Christ is, the incarnate God, as well as what he has done. Right? For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and upon his shoulders shall be the government, and he shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Father of Eternity is a good translation there, and the Prince or Ruler of Peace. Okay, and of the increase of his government and of peace there shall be no end, to establish and maintain the throne of David, the Lord of hosts, and his passion shall achieve this. Okay, literally the zeal of the Lord of hosts, the zeal of Yahweh Tsabaoth, the God of war, will achieve this. He will do it, and indeed we rejoice and triumph every single Lord's Day, as we are doing this morning, that indeed the zeal of the Lord did in fact achieve this. This is what we do every single Sunday, as well as throughout the week. We rejoice in triumph. We celebrate the conquest of death and the destruction of the powers of darkness, that though they still exist, Christ has bound the strong man, to use his own verbiage. Okay? That to plunder a house, you must indeed bind the defender of that house, of the strong man. And in his death, burial, and resurrection, the apostles point to the fulfillment of that. And so that such powers are broken and shattered in their ability to keep the nations under the kind of pagan darkness that they for so long were dwelling under. And hence the gospel, the light of the kingdom of God, as opposed to the darkness of the kingdom of death, has now been going forth for 2,000 years and counting. We see this playing out even here. What we do is not in isolation, but when we read these passages, we are seeing our own history, the history of the people of God, the history that for many of us as Gentiles we have been grafted into, to use the Apostle Paul's words from the book of Romans. And so then as he says that Yahweh your God gave this land to you as a possession, he says, continuing through verse 18, all you men of valor shall cross over armed before your brothers, the sons of Israel. The men of valor, men of renown, men of greatness. There's a variety of different ways in which that word or that phrase really can be translated. But speaking of your great warriors, your warriors who now have actually proven themselves in battle, who are now actually worthy to be called, in this case here, men of valor. Describing the fact that they have proven themselves, they have been put through great testing, great trial, right? Great tribulation in the heat of war, through the crucible of battle, and they have now triumphed in and through that by the grace of God. Unlike the generation which had been brought out, which God had done everything for, yet still fell away, it still apostatized in that sense. Here, now the newer generation, having triumphed over the enemies of God, having been successful against all odds, have gone through the great difficulties that face the people of God as they combat darkness, as they combat evil in this world, and yet have triumphed through this. It's reminiscent, even on the most foundational level, that he who endures to the end shall be saved. That there is this sense in which he who perseveres by the grace of God will ultimately triumph, will receive what the New Testament refers to as the victor's crown, okay? The Stephanos, which is also where we get the name Stephen from, okay? As in like the proto-martyr Stephen himself, the first martyr, meaning crown. In the Greek context, in the New Testament, this is referring to the victor's crown, which you'll be familiar with by another name, a laurel wreath, that you usually would associate with the Olympics. Okay, the gold medal, the champion in the ancient Pan-Hellenic games, there were 4 of them, but the most famous of them was the games at Olympia in the Valley of Elis. Incredible time and festival that was a religious festival first and foremost that the games were part of. And you would, in triumph in your particular event, receive a wreath fashioned into a crown. Okay, this was known as the Stephanos. This was the victor's crown. Okay, it was a symbol of triumph. This is why the Apostle Paul at times uses athletic language. He who endures to the end shall be saved, and talks about us running the race, right, of life. Okay, and he's using and employing this familiar athletic language, this Olympic language, to his own Hellenistic culture, right, that people would have been immediately familiar with. It's similar how the Apostle Paul, speaking of him, also employs quite often militant language, okay, militaristic language. Probably most famously in the latter portions of the book of Ephesians, about the armour of God. And therein him describing the standard combat uniform of a Greco-Roman soldier, particularly of a Roman, things that were familiar, but indeed things that are deeply militant. This is why, by the way, throughout church history, the church has been understood in 2 senses. The church militant, that is to say the church at war here on earth against darkness, against evil, against principalities and powers and authorities and dominions and all the various language that the Apostle Paul and others employ. And then the church triumphant, okay, the church that has passed through, again, the crucible of death, yet has not been destroyed by it, but by the grace of God has triumphed through death, for whom death is no longer an enemy that is able to destroy, but rather becomes a gateway through which one triumphs. Okay, hence the term the church triumphant. Church militant, us. The church at war. The church triumphant, those who have triumphed, who have received the victor's crown. Like our dear Irene is now part of the church triumphant. It's the one church still joined, right? The same spirit, the same body of Christ. Because again, we firmly believe, as the church always has, that death does not ultimately separate us. Death can't separate us from the love of Christ. It doesn't separate us from the love of Christ. In fact, ironically, it brings us closer. But we are joined with him. This is the communion of the saints. We've preached on this before, but this is the communion of the saints that we proclaim, and we see proclaimed through the classic creeds of the church, like that of the Apostles and the Nicene Creed, for example. That indeed those who have triumphed through death are indeed perhaps even more alive than we are. This is the great hope that we also ourselves look forward to. The difference being that here, the Israelites, in the ultimate sense, the meta-narrative perspective, are looking forward to the Messiah. We look back. And so this is why we refer to the incarnate Christ as the axis upon which redemptive history revolves. Okay, time itself is literally marked by the time before Christ and the time that is now Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, the one who has conquered over all things, including time itself. But here in verse 18 we find another principle, that all you men of valor, all you now worthy warriors who are going to go forth, of course, as part of the conquest, realize that indeed you also who have now been appointed or allotted this land east of the Jordan, that's what we've seen verses 12 through 17, you don't get to kick up your feet and just hang out now. There's things to do. The land still needs to be subdued. The dominion mandate that God indeed said, even from their time, thousands of years prior to Adam, to go forth into the world and to take dominion. Okay, that word in the Hebrew, without spending too long talking about it, is actually a very, very militant word. Okay, it's a very direct connotation of conquest. Okay, very direct. And we don't quite we get that when we say the word dominion. It just has to be explained what that word means in the Hebrew. But here, this same principle is still applying. Those who have actually come into the land appointed to them, they don't just simply get to dust off their hands and just chill out. No, indeed, they're all part of the one mission. They're all part of the people of God. They need to be there to support their fellow brothers, to be there with the fellow sons of Israel. In verse 19, your wives and your little ones and your livestock, I know you have much livestock, it's an interesting little injection there from Moses, shall remain in your cities, which I have given you, until Yahweh gives the rest of your brothers as to you, and they also possess the land which Yahweh your God will give to them beyond the Jordan, that is west of the Jordan. Then you may return, every man to his possession which I have given you. So because they had simply come into the land that was to be theirs, right, in this case east of the Jordan, they were not now to just simply let the rest of their fellow sons of Israel, the rest of their people, just go off while they just get to relax. No. They're part of the one mission. They're part of redemptive history as much as the others. And they were to continue to help and aid and play their part in the fulfillment of God's redemptive mission, okay, in redeeming the land of Canaan from evil. This has so many applications in the New Covenant, we could do an entire series on it. But in the simplest possible terms, this describes, in very, very direct terms, the entire theological basis for evangelism and for mission. Do you see the point? Okay. It took approximately, in terms of by the time you get a widespread cultural change, a widespread kind of diffusion and number, it took approximately 1300-ish, 1400-ish, 1500-ish years for Europe to become Christian. Okay? Christianity had entered every nation in all of Europe, essentially by about the year 1000 AD. Okay? The last of those people being the Slavs to the east, right? The ancestors of people like the Russians and the Ukrainians, for example, okay, called the Kievan Rus. But broadly speaking, that mission was in excess of 1,000 years before Europe becomes Christian. Okay? She's going through some problems now, but point being, these are things that can be recovered from. Europe, check. Okay? Other parts of the world too. Again, the Middle East, historically, is overwhelmingly Christian. We often think of it as deeply Islamic, post the Islamic conquest, but prior to that, we fail to understand that many different nations were entirely Christian in almost every possible facet. Places like Armenia, for example, which had the first Christian king. Depending on which one you think, there's two different options, but either way, they would be the first. Their people, by the time the Roman emperors start converting to Christianity and paganism is driven out of the Roman state, by that point, Armenia is, functionally speaking, 95+% Christian. It's almost entirely Christian. It is a Christian kingdom and the first Christian nation in history. North Africa, the lands of Egypt, and the lands all throughout what today we would call Libya and Tunisia and Morocco, etc. Resoundingly Christian, including famous figures which some of you will be familiar with, like Augustine. Okay, Augustine of Hippo, that's North Africa. Right? St. Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, Egypt. All such other figures. But indeed, when Europe became Christian, would it have been right or proper for Europeans to then just simply kick up their feet and relax like the people here could have otherwise been tempted to do? No. Because indeed, what is the command? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, based on that premise, go and make disciples of all nations. For indeed, to use the Old Testament verbiage, the coastlands await the law of God. Indeed, how precious is the feet of those who bring good news. This is used typologically, not only in reference to those bringing good news to Zion, to Jerusalem, but then from that the prophets make the point out to the world. Hence why we have these famous words by the time we get to the New Testament, that the gospel was to go forth from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and to all the world, okay, to all the nations, as part of the great redemptive plan of God, which on the ultimate sense is what? To reconcile the nations to himself, to reverse the event at Babel, back in Genesis chapter 11. This is where the nations are divorced from God. Okay, this is from this point onward, from Genesis chapter 11, where the nations are then separated. When the B'nai Elohim, these ones referred to in Genesis 6, for example, as the sons of God, not capital S but lowercase s, right? The ones who would become known as the gods, lowercase g, plural, are then in dark authority over these places. They are separated, not just physically but also linguistically and therefore culturally, and they are divorced from God. Prior to that, any and all sin was actually an act of apostasy. There was exactly one religion. It was the religion of God. But they are divorced by their own actions in rebellion against their creator of Babel. The whole point of the incarnation is God, the divine, reconciling man, humanity, unto himself. He does this literally in his person, the representative element being so vitally important, and then through and from that, he does it through the gospel. So he embodies it and then he does it. This is how God operates. And so what we have then in the biggest sense, in the big picture, is God redeeming the nations. Think not that I've come to judge the world, but to redeem it. Of course, there's judgment. That's obvious when you read the rest of the scriptures. But he has not come to to annihilate all the other nations. He has actually come to redeem them and to reconcile them unto himself. In the exact same form, again, big picture, that we see prototyped here, the people of God moving into the land, the promised land, to redeem it from darkness and from corruption. So too is that the case in the kingdom of God. Hence why Christ is able to say in the Beatitudes, with regards to those who would inherit the earth, right? This is the whole concept. It's the restoration of earth and heaven, as you had all the way back in the Garden of Eden, where heaven and earth were united. But then through what? Sin, were they separated. So hence why everything we do here is an act of reconciling heaven and earth. We ourselves have been reconciled. We ourselves are the temple of God. It is not fixed in some geolocality, but instead now is mobile. It is everywhere. And it spreads and can spread exponentially so. This is what we are able to see as we look back upon what is being brought into fruition in time and space in history here, that we then can look back on and then also see our part in this very same redemptive history. There's a point here that has to be drawn, especially in regards to what's actually literally being said. This is the land which your God, which Yahweh, gave to you as a possession, which he has appointed to you. It's reminiscent of the kind of language that we're actually going to be getting onto in a couple of weeks in our Bible study in Acts 17, which we're up to now in this chapter, where the Apostle Paul gives his famous speech at the Areopagus in Athens, before the greatest minds of his day. And he says therein in verse 26 the following: He, referring to God, made from one man every nation of mankind to inhabit all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and boundaries of their habitation. Now, this is ultimately part of a broader point that the Apostle Paul's making specifically about who the Creator God actually is. But this speaks, at least theologically, to what we're seeing here. God is the one who sets the boundaries of nations. We actually saw, as a passing reference, but we saw Moses make the point in previous weeks about how indeed, I believe it was either the Moabites or the Ammonites, had come into their land, which they hadn't formerly been in, but had rather driven out some of the Rephaim, son of the Anakim, the giants that were dwelling in that land. So they too had actually done this very thing. God is the one who moves the nations of the earth like pieces on a chessboard, so it were. This is what Yahweh does. Why? Well, there's 1,000 reasons why. But at a fundamental level, it is because he is the creator of the heavens and the earth. He is therefore the ruler of the heavens and the earth. And Yahweh, he sits in the heavens and he does all that he pleases. He does whatever he wills, not arbitrarily, but rather perfectly. Not just on a whim, but with very decisive, specific, intentional, meaningful, purposeful, and deliberate action. He moves the nations. He sets their boundaries. He raises up great and mighty kingdoms, even those drenched in paganism and in darkness and evil, and at other times he brings them down. There was a point at which Egypt was by far the mightiest and most glorious kingdom on the face of the earth. And then over the course of centuries, it was brought to ruin. It was itself conquered by the likes of the Assyrian Empire in all of their might, who conquered the land of Egypt, who indeed conquered the lands of Israel, who swept the 10 northern tribes off into obscurity, who were never heard nor seen from ever again. all to then be conquered by a greater empire coming on their heels, the Neo-Babylonian or the New Babylonian Empire, the one who conquers Jerusalem itself. All for then their fall to come very rapidly, a fiery existence, a quick rise and an equally quick fall at the hands of their neighbours to the east, who we know as the Achaemenid Empire, that is the Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, the one who the prophet Isaiah foretells of by name nearly 150 years before his existence. And they rise to build the most powerful empire in the world. And this keeps cycling on and cycling forward. All of this, even whilst being done and perpetrated often for evil, as with the case of the pagan empires, it is all being done with the ultimate and express permission and will of God. The way in which the gospel itself spread was overwhelmingly aided by the fact that basically the entire known world, in all of its meaningful parts at least, had become Hellenistic. That is to say, it had become Greek. It had become Greek literally through the diaspora of Greek people, of Hellenic peoples, and by extension even more broadly, their culture, their customs, their language, their philosophy, their politics, etc. That's why the New Testament is written for you in what language? Greek. The lingua franca. It would be exactly equivalent to if God were doing this in our day, he would naturally and obviously write it in what language? English. Okay? This is why. But there's a point to be made here. God is the one who determines the boundaries of nations, because the earth is fundamentally good. It is not fundamentally evil. That ironically can become a pagan view. The whole concept of God redeeming the land is because the material creation was made by whom? God. The one created God, not the gods, the lesser gods of the nations. Most people are surprised when I actually explain to them that the common denominator across pagan religions, and there's a very long list of common denominators because it's the same system, but one of the most fundamental ones, certainly in regards to what we call cosmogony, so origins, right, is that the gods actually come forth from the creation, not the other way around. Does that make sense? Okay. The Greek gods, the Roman gods, the Egyptian gods, Babylonian, you can pick anyone you want here, even more distant and obscure, like those of the Polynesian peoples before the arrival of Christianity. The gods, the deities, no matter how numerous they may be, they actually come forth from the creation. They come forth ultimately from a very consistent thread, which is usually and encapsulated in a sky father and an earth mother. Okay? Gaia to the Greeks, for example, the goddess of the earth, the mother earth. This is why you get this term even in the silliness of modern paganism of Mother Earth, right? That's where that concept comes from. Okay? The gods come forth from that particular cultural encapsulation of the sky father and the earth mother. This is why in Jeremiah chapter 10, to see how God kind of just puts the nail in the coffin on this, in the middle of Jeremiah chapter 10, which obviously in Hebrew, he flips in verse 11 into Aramaic, the language of the Mesopotamian peoples, okay? The language of the pagans. And he says to them, all the gods who did not create the heavens and the earth will be crushed from the earth and from beneath the heavens. Right? That is to say that all the gods who came forth from the heavens and the earth will be crushed beneath them. Because this is what it ultimately is. You either ultimately worship the creation or the creator. Even high, exalted, divine, kind of lowercase d beings, right? Those that we refer to by a broad term demonic, although that term has more specific meaning, we refer to them broadly as demonic. Those who were the gods of old, okay, they were created. Yes, they were real. They were real not in the sense that the ancient peoples fully perceived them, so all the stories that you find doesn't mean that all those are true, but the fundamental reality, and the Bible says so, is that indeed, yes, those gods were real. Those powers were real. They were dark, they were evil, and they had ruled over the peoples. They had corrupted the peoples, and the peoples had built their corrupt cultures in response. That is different from the material creation itself. What I'm trying to get you to do here is to see the way that the church has rightfully understood this throughout history, especially in the ancient world, where the Greeks often got this very confused, unfortunately. The creation itself, we see throughout Genesis 1, each and every day, and the Lord saw that it was good, and it was good, and it was good. And we get all the way to the end, and it was very good, which is an amplification of the word good. The material creation, the world, the cosmos, the heavens and the earth, are fundamentally good because they've been created by God. It is then the evil and sin of humans and of human culture, of human religion, of idolatry and everything else in between that then perverts that. So the redemption here going on, and it's about to go on, west of the Jordan in the land of Canaan, is redeeming even the world that God made from the kind of cancer that is paganism and driving it out. This is why the command to drive it out is so vitally important, because it's driving out evil. It's truly, in that sense, taking dominion. Dominion not for evil, dominion not for darkness, but dominion for what? Good. Dominion for order, dominion for light, and bringing light into the world. This is the very point of what the Apostle Paul mentions, of what multiple apostles mention. This is what the prophets speak of so often. And it is why we are seeing this portrayed here to us. That they are to go forth and be part of the mission of God. That they are to continue the good work, to fight the good fight of the faith, to use the New Testament verbiage. Not to settle and rest and go, yep, we're good now, good luck fellas, but rather to go forth in union and solidarity with the brotherhood of Christ, to demonstrate love for the brotherhood, and to continue to fight against darkness. This is why such arguments against the spread of Christianity around the world, even from those well-meaning often, but God bless, blind Christians, who tend to view the spread of Christianity to North America and South America and even our land of Australia as some negative thing. Right? That it was nothing more than barbarous and brutal imperialism and colonialism, whilst completely neglecting the fact that the best thing that happened to this continent was the arrival of this. What means did God use to do it? He used giant ships with a red, white and blue flag on them. Is that a carte blanche, kind of apologetic for anything and everything that ever happened? Obviously not. Were sins committed along the way? Of course they were. Because, as you may well know, human beings were involved. And that tends to mean that sin will come with it. But it is so obvious and so clear from just a fundamental analysis of history, where you actually bother to do the work of trying to reduce any sense of bias or subjectivity, that God clearly and evidently used what we call the age of exploration, right? The explorative missions of the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire, etc., to spread the gospel around the world. And without being smart, this shouldn't be a revolutionary thought. This shouldn't be bewildering. God used the often very violent conquests of the pagan Roman Empire for the purpose of the gospel. The Romans arrived, for example, in Britannia, what would become the province of Britannia, basically modern day England and Wales, in the 1st century, all but 15 years, barely, not even 15 years, after Christ. And by the time you get to that particular point, the gospel is now well spreading around the eastern portions of the world, and you have men like Aristobulus, who you can read about online, who is the man who brings Christianity to the very new Roman province of Britannia, all but literally a couple of years after Rome actually successfully this time conquers. They tried to about 100 years prior under Julius Caesar. The Celts drove them back and defeated them. But here now Rome managed to successfully conquer my ancestors. And guess what happened? That was the exact mechanism that God used to allow the gospel to come in on its heels. Because Rome brought what? Well, it brought war, but through war, what did it bring? Order. It brought peace. And God's very clear how he feels about the Roman Empire. Right? The Roman Empire, from the Bible's perspective, is the worst thing that ever happened, short of the great apostasy in Jerusalem in the 1st century. But even that was itself in league with Rome. And yet that's exactly what he used for the spread of the gospel. We pointed this out in our Bible study in Acts, where we've just finished, where on Paul's second missionary journey, they're in Philippi. And they're travelling along Roman roads, very famous Roman roads, actually, by the way, through that part of Macedonia in northern Greece. Do you understand? Roman roads, which allowed for the gospel to be spread. This is how God works. Should I stand around demanding apologies and demanding reparations for the often brutal Roman conquest of my ancestors? Who owes me money? Do the Italians owe me money? Do the Romans specifically? How about when the English arrived from what today we would call northern Germany, the Anglo-Saxon people who were not native to Britannia? Perhaps Germany owes me money too. Or what about when the Vikings arrived on dragon longships across the North Sea, these brutal barbarians that no one had heard of, that now brought hell and destruction? Perhaps Norway and Denmark and Sweden owe me money also. Or then maybe even the Normans, descendants of the Vikings from France. So perhaps also the French owe me money also. Or what we could do, and here's a novel thought, perhaps we could stop attempting to be victims of things which didn't happen to us personally, and instead realize that God is sovereign over all things. The fact that the land is actually God's land. And with the utter importance of property rights, by the way, you get property rights from this, so for anyone who defends property rights, thank you, Christian, thank you, local Christian. It comes from this. Property rights only make sense in the context of God being the one who gives and the one who takes away. God gives the land, not the authority of men. God gives, God takes away. God determines the boundaries of nations. God moves them as he wills. This is an important point, because this is a large portion of where the debate is in our own day. Now, to forewarn you, later this month we will have a sermon specifically dedicated to the issues that are going to be discussed and debated and then voted upon in the coming referendum on the voice. Okay, the voice parliament. We're going to have at least one sermon, there may be more, because these are actually extremely important issues that Christians have to step forward on and actually do their duty on. Because we already are kind of on the back foot, because there's already, unfortunately, too many of my fellow clergymen who have their heads so buried in the sand that they wouldn't know up from down anymore. Okay? There are far too many men in my position who have forgotten the fact that they are meant to be vertebrates with spines, that instead are more caring or more concerned with appealing to sensibilities and to emotions than to reason, than to logic, than to truth. And when I say that, I mean God's truth, not just whatever truth someone is feeling like is true today. And so these are important issues which we need to discuss. Was God wrong in giving this land to the Israelites? Is there a Christian who would like to try and mount this argument? Is there somehow, somewhere, someone who would like to try and mount the argument that indeed the meek shall not inherit the earth? Good luck. These are important issues because they speak ultimately to the character and the will of God in this world. It turns these kinds of passages not just into something they're not meant to be, it's actually worse. It turns them into evil passages. It turns them into erroneous passages. It turns them into passages which make God a brutal demiurge, right? A tyrannical deity. And if your interpretation of Scripture turns God into a sinner, you may perhaps, and I suggest this nicely, want to reconsider. That's where you end up with. On a final point that comes to us from this passage, it follows through, and we'll circle back to the point I'm trying to make here, but as it follows through with verse 21 and 22, and I commanded Joshua at that time, saying, your eyes have seen all that Yahweh your God has done to these two kings, referring to Sihon and Og. So Yahweh shall do to all the kingdoms into which you are about to cross, vis-a-vis the point I had just been making to you. Do not fear them, for Yahweh your God is the one fighting for you. Now, on this concept of fighting, okay, I want you to hearken back to verse, 19, on an important point. But your wives, this is referring to the Israelite warriors going forth, continuing the mission, but, Moses says in verse 19, but your wives and your little ones and your livestock, I know that you have much, shall remain in your cities, which I have given to you. Okay? That is to say, the women and the children and the livestock, they remain here. The men go forth to war. Okay. We either tend to miss the extremely important point here because, in fairness, throughout most of Western history, this would have been such an obvious point. You could have just kept reading and never having to actually make it. We unfortunately do not have the luxury of living in such logical times. And so, unfortunately, these kinds of points actually have to get made. Where I have to stand up here as a pastor and a theologian and explain what men and women are. And explain that God actually, made men and women, that those are actually real categories, that you can't just obliterate through blind demonic ideology, but also, more importantly, that it's not just a matter of function, but actual nature. In Deuteronomy, later on in this book, in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 5, Yahweh says, women are to not dress as men, and men are to not dress as women. That's the simple translation, okay? On a more specific level, to give you the way in which that kind of terminology is used, particularly in the Hebrew, with regards especially to women dressing as men, it is not actually simply talking about what we kind of historically call cross-dressing or transvestitism, right, for example, okay? It certainly is on the men's side, because cross-dressing, transvestitism or transgenderism as the kind of evolved ideology today is primarily an issue of men, not of women, at least historically. This here, though, in reference to what's going on in the Hebrew, is referring to women not dressing as warriors. Okay? Geber, the word for man there, is the word routinely used throughout Hebrew to describe a warrior. Okay. It's actually, in a very literal sense in Hebrew, saying, do not dress up in a combat uniform. Do not dress up as a man of war. Okay? Because that's the distinct, identifiable attire of a man. If there's anything that distinguishes a man, it's a warrior. The Israelites understood this. Every single one of their absolutely horrific, barbaric, and demonic pagan neighbours understood this. We're the simpletons, so consumed with pride, so drowning in hubris, that we can't even get something straight that Babylon did get straight. Do you understand? We're confused on things that Egypt was correct on. Okay? Where we will send our women forth to battle. And it doesn't just pertain just to battle. The broader point here is often as the scriptures go, there's the letter of the law, and then there's the spirit of the law. Okay? There's the actual lettering of the law, which is very important, especially in a book like Deuteronomy. But then there is the spirit of the law behind that. Right? This is what Christ does. Right? You have heard it said, "You shall not murder." But I say to you, he who hates his brother has already murdered him in his heart. Right? That wasn't a negation of murder. He was saying, yes, no, that's 100% correct. But here's the deeper meaning of that. Yeah? You following me? The same thing goes here. Of turning your women into subpar men. Because that's all you'll ever achieve. You will only ever achieve subpar. Is it because men are these just brilliant creatures that we should all worship? Of course not. What it is saying is actually the opposite, and that's what I'm saying to you. It's the fact that God has made men and women. He has made them in the image of God, male and female. He created them, right? Speaking to the fact that both men and women are actually the full representation of the image of God, of who God is. But yet those are distinct and separate characteristics. Those are distinct, what we call ontological natures. It's not just about function, right? So what you do, it's actually about who we are. And see, our world, modern Western world, as crazy as it's become, tries to propagate this, but really actually can't. If you speak of just the military context, for example, most Western militaries now, increasingly so over the last 5 to 10 years, have allowed women into combat roles, for example. Okay? So, infantry, artillery, etc. Okay? Frontline combat roles, right? War fighting roles. Americans have done this, we've done this, the Canadians have done this, etc., etc. Except when you actually go to enlist, be it enlistment or commission, doesn't really matter. The men's standards are X and the women's standards are Y. They're not the same physical fitness standards to get in. So at the same time as you're trying to propagate this false egalitarianism, you aren't actually even living up to it because you end up running into this thing called reality, where the women cannot actually physically keep up with the men because they've been designed differently. Do you understand? And this goes more broadly than just combat. This goes to all facets of society. Because as one should rightfully stand up as a Christian against egalitarianism in combat, seeking equality between men and women falsely in things like combat, what we actually see, and I'm saying this as a pastor, is that women were in the pulpits long before women were in the cockpits of F-18 fighter jets. Do you understand? We're the ones who have brought this on. Ironically, the culture in the state is just following suit. You know full well, those of us who were at the Baptist Assembly earlier this year, where a significant proportion of the Assembly pastorate, which obviously in this case myself and Michael are a part of, are women. And by the way, a not insignificant percentage are also divorced and remarried men, which is expressly prohibited with regards to the clergy. This never would have flown any time before the 20th and 21st centuries. But yet here we are. Because what it's doing on the issue of the men and women men thing is it's changing and trying, and ultimately failing to, but trying to change the very character and nature of who men and women are. It is overtly a demonic attempt to destroy the image of God, because without being smart, the overarching goal of the forces of darkness has always been to destroy the image of God. Okay? They hate you with a passion, a fury, and a power which, quite frankly, you're incapable of comprehending. Not because you're stupid, but because we're mortal and we're finite. And what you are seeing play out before you today is just old demons with new tricks. Do you understand? That's all it is. It's the same playbook, just adjusted for a modern day, where we turn our women into killers, where we turn our women into death dealers. Dealing in death is for men. There are times, quite frankly, when killing is needing to be done. You've seen this the last couple of weeks. Okay? And it's the men's job to do that, because with responsibility comes duty, and with duty comes responsibility. Men have the duty to do this, and they also bear the often horrific burden of having to do such things, of having to confront evil. And this doesn't mean that women are no part of this, by the way. This is not a relegating of women to some subpar standard. I, in consort with the consistent teaching of the church, are actually the ones who are elevating women, who are actually elevating women to the rightful status in the eyes of God. It's pagan culture that demeans women. It's Christian culture that recognises that women are made in the image of God, and that not only just have within themselves ontologically the image-bearing nature of God, but also have an equally vital role to play in, like this says, the redemptive history. Because while in this passage the men were going off to war, what were the women doing? Sitting around and braiding each other's hair and doing a whole bunch of nothing but gossip? No. They were keeping the kingdom running. They were keeping the ship afloat. Did not our own ancestors, our own mothers and grandmothers, keep the ship afloat as the men went off to war in World War I and World War II? Indeed, yes? It's the Christian social ethic, it's the Christian worldview which elevates women to the rightful place, to the rightful nature, to the rightful status, whilst actually acknowledging that it's the distinctions between men and women that allow men and women to actually flourish, as opposed to blending it, merging it through this false, erroneous, and ultimately destructive egalitarianism, as we've been suffering for 200 plus years now, that ends up actually crushing women. And if you want the example of that, it's a thing called transgender bathrooms. It's called Drag Queen Story Hour. It's called men in a wig and jewellery going into women's locker rooms and women's sport and dominating and women gold medal and doing this and doing that. But then again, this is what we deserve. This is what we deserve. We've been running this play for 100 years in the West, where we've been ardently and overtly rebelling against the biblical distinctions between men and women, and all of that means in terms of the image of God. We've been rebelling against that since the late 1800s, early 1900s, and we're suffering the consequence, where now ultimately we turn our women into killers. I'll leave you with this final thing that ties this in. One of the most interesting passages for me, in actually all of the Old Testament, comes from Exodus chapter 23, I believe verse 19 off memory, where God gives the command to not boil a kid meaning a baby goat, not a little child, right? Not boiling a baby goat in its mother's milk. Now for most people that kind of just goes straight over the head, because it's kind of like, okay, I guess so, I won't do that. Like, but I can't tell you why though, right? It's actually an extremely poignant point that ties into exactly what we've said here. Okay. The eating of a goat for food was perfectly fine, right? We have dominion over all things, including the animals. And they're to be served, they serve our purposes in God's grand design of the world, not the other way around. But boiling a kid, they used to say cooking the baby goat in its mother's milk, is taking that which is meant for life, the mother's milk, and using it for death. Do you understand? It's basically God's doing the same kind of thing that, well, God himself did, Christ, in you have heard it said, you shall not murder, but I say to you, don't hate, right? It's the spirit and the letter. There's the entire point and purpose behind it. It's like how the Apostle Paul speaks of in regards to making sure your ministers are taken care of. I'm not trying to say this as shameless promotion. It's ironic that I'm in this position, but it is what it is. Don't muzzle the ox while it treads out the grain. Okay, that's coming back from the Old Testament. And it's not because, we need to make sure that we protect the ox at all costs. There's a deeper point of the law, the spirit of the law. This is the case back in Exodus 23 on this very point. Not using that which is meant for life and turning it or corrupting it for the purposes of death. Like one might say, for example, taking the very instrument, the very realm, the very ecosystem that is purpose-built by God to create life, the worm, and turning it into a chamber of death, turning it literally into a tomb. This is how we destroy this. And we destroy it on that basis, and we destroy it on greater bases. So the part where women are meant to be nurturing life givers, we turn them into killers there. And then the part where they're not meant to be, war, we send them there and turn them into killers. So on both extremes of the proverbial spectrum, we destroy the image of God in women. And everything else in between just follows suit. This is the culture of death. And this is the kind of culture of death which they were fighting against. This is the culture of death which we fight against also. And it is high time that the church, that Christians, actually start getting into the fight. Amen.